Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off in the last episode, which was part 9 of my bass guitar build. And in this episode, part 10, this should be the last in this series where I talk about building this bass guitar. And what I'm going to cover is the final setup work that I'm going to do, and this will be focused primarily on doing some of the fret work. So there's a lot that I need to cover. Let's get started. Before I can do any fret work on this guitar, I've got to set the action of the strings. And I'm going to do that by measuring the distance between the bottom of the string and the top of the 12th fret, as well as the bottom of the string and the top of the 1st fret. Now, the height of that distance at the 12th fret can be adjusted by simply raising or lowering the bridge saddles to achieve the distance. And the way I measure it is I use a string action gauge, and I set it on the 12th fret. And this gauge has increments marked in 64ths of an inch. And what I'll do is I will try to raise or lower the string so that the bottom is about 7/64ths of an inch above that 12th fret. Now at the 1st fret, in order to get the action at the right height, I need to check the depth of the slots that I cut in the nut. Now, if you'll remember in the last episode, part 9, I made the nut, and when I cut those slots, I kept the depth quite a bit higher than I felt it was going to actually need to be as I finished this guitar. That way I could gradually increase the depth until I got that string action exactly where I want it to be at the 1st fret. So really the best way to do it is to start by deepening the slots and getting the string height exactly right at the 1st fret. Then you would raise or lower the saddles to achieve the correct action at the 12th fret. And once that's done, I can proceed with the next steps to leveling all the frets. Once the action had been set, I played each string at each fret, and what I'm looking for here is the 1 or 2 frets that stick up higher than all the other ones. As I played each string up and down the neck, I found that from the 1st fret up to about the 12th fret, the guitar played pretty clean. I had no problems with buzzing or notes fretting out. However, once I got past that 12th fret, I started to run into some trouble. And I was able to isolate the problem to the very last fret on the fretboard. So that's where I'm going to start out my leveling process. I'm going to level just that last fret and bring it down a little bit closer to the other frets before I determine what additional work will be necessary to get these frets level and playable. I'll leave the strings on the guitar as I'm doing this work, but of course I'm going to have to loosen them up and then move them out of the way so I have access to the frets. To confirm that that last fret is higher than the rest, what I'll do is I'll take a fret rocker and place it on the 3 frets in front of it, and then I'll slide the rocker back and forth, and if the corner of the rocker runs into the fret, I know it's too high. Then I can take my 3-corner file and start removing some of the material from the top of the fret to make it level. After leveling that fret, I'll take my 3-corner file and recrown it. Leveling frets produces a lot of debris, and you got to get that off so it doesn't scratch or ruin the finish. Then I tuned up the guitar after I was finished with that leveling and recrowning and played each string at each fret to make sure that I had fixed that one excessively high fret. Then I could start to determine what additional fretwork needs to be done. Since a guitar string's maximum amplitude of oscillation occurs above the 12th fret, it's a good idea to induce what is known as fret fall off, and that's where you level the frets from about the 14th or 15th fret to the end of the fretboard at a slight downward angle towards the bridge. And to do that, I'm going to mask off the frets that I don't want affected by the leveling process. And then I'm going to attach a strip of 240 grit sandpaper to my leveling beam, and as you'll see here, I'm only placing it on half of the beam. Then I'll place 2 strips of binding tape on the 13th fret, and what this will do is when I set the leveling beam down on the frets, that tape will elevate the end of the beam so that I'm actually leveling it downward at a slight angle towards the bridge. Because it's impossible to know exactly how much material to remove, it's a good idea to work in gradual increments. That way you're not taking off more than what's necessary. Once I've finished adding the fall off, I'll use my 3-corner file to recrown each of those frets that was scraped down. Even though I'm confident the rest of the frets are level, since I have the strings off, I'll go ahead and check each of the frets 3 at a time with my fret rocker to see if there's any unexpected high spots. Then I'll retune the strings, and once again I'll play each string at each fret to double check and make sure that all the frets are level. Then I can grab some 220 grit sandpaper to sand out any of the file marks that were left during that leveling and crowning process. Of course, I'll follow this up with 400 and then 800 grit sandpaper to get the frets as smooth as possible. I'll use a succession of medium fine and extra fine Scotch-Brite pads to put a little bit of polish on the frets. Then I'll tune the strings for a 4th time and play each string at each fret, looking for any unexpected high spots. And if I encounter one, I'll use a Sharpie marker to mark where those little high spots are so I can go back in and do a little bit of spot leveling. When I do my spot leveling, I'll just leave the strings in place, but I'll lift them up out of the way so that I can get to the fret with my 3-corner file. And then I'll just grind down the spot where I had marked it with a Sharpie indicating a high spot. Then I can just drop the strings back in place and test play the guitar at those frets to make sure that I've reduced that high spot. Now, in all honesty, this technique does require some experience to be successful, because as you remove material from one fret, it can affect how the frets on either side will perform. So it's critical to know exactly how much material to remove to fix the problem without creating new problems. And of course, once I've finished spot leveling, I've got to recrown, resand, and repolish just the frets that I actually worked on. And finally, the very last step in building this guitar is to attach the truss rod cover. And since it's attached with 3 very tiny screws, I'm going to cake the threads with some paste furniture wax, which will help make it easier to thread them into the wood without breaking off the heads. Then I'll position the truss rod cover into position on the headstock, and I'll drill some pilot holes for those screws. Now, I'll confess, I'm not a bass player. Plus, I play left-handed, so playing right-handed is a bit of a challenge for me. I could easily hand this guitar over to somebody who is skilled at playing bass. However, I still feel it is necessary for me to play every string at every fret and to test out the controls myself before I'm willing to let anybody else either play this guitar or consider purchasing it. Well, guys, that's all the time I have for this episode. The Highline Horn of Plenty bass guitar is now completely finished. So I hope that you've enjoyed this series. And of course, if you have, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, all that good stuff. But at this point, I'm going to put this bass guitar aside for a while and hang it up on the wall, let it sit for a couple of weeks. And that will let the strings stretch out, let the wood kind of rest and settle in, the finish to, reach its maximum full cure. And at that point, I will come back and revisit the setup, make sure everything's okay. Usually it is. And then I'll put it up for sale. And once it sells, I will then do a final checkup of the setup, make sure that everything is dialed in just right. I'll put it in the case and ship it off to its new owner. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great weekend, a great week ahead, and I'll see you soon.